Good evening, everyone, and welcome to episode 112 of SCOTONOMICS. Thanks so much for joining us this evening. If you're joining us on Facebook or Twitter or what else we got on YouTube. Thanks so much for joining us this evening for the live session and conversation and questions as well. Now I've welcomed all you, I'd like to welcome my co-host, Karen Van Sweden. Hello, Karen, how are you doing?
I'm good. Yeah. Lots going on. So I've had a very busy day. We had full council today. Economics things. I have just been reading about Starling Bank. I don't know if you've picked up on that as well. I noticed them advertising a few years ago, and
Starling Bank.
Yeah, Starling Bank. Apparently, a bank built on shockingly lax customer checks. The other thing I wanted to bring up for our audience as well is that
that's not on the marketing. That's not on the marketing material, is it?
I don't know. I just noticed that. And the other thing I wanted to bring up and remind our audience is that the Scottish Currency Group have now got all the films, which I know that you helped make, on YouTube now, so they can learn about what happened there.
Brilliant. I'll find a link. I'll find a link when the film's on, and we'll post that, because the content at the conference was fantastic. It was really good. It was a good, enjoyable couple of days. Well, speaking of movies and films and things like that, the Finding the Money film is now available on Vimeo, and you can rent that for $2.99, and that's just come on today. On Friday, for those who are watching live or the repeat before Friday, we're hosting a watch party at 8 p.m. on Friday. So if you can hold off until then to watch the film, just follow the link on Vimeo, pay your $2.99, start at 8 o'clock, and then you can join the chat with everyone else on X and comment along with watching the film. There's a rumour that Stephanie Kelton's going to jump on and help answer some of the questions that the UK audience are going to do as well. If not, I'll be doing that. So hopefully, for everyone's sake, it'll be Stephanie that she jumps on. So that's on Friday. Before that, we've got a brilliant episode this evening. Now, we've been trying to meet Fraser Stewart for about a year, and unfortunately we couldn't get our 3 diaries lined up, but I was able to head up to Dundee to interview Fraser just a few weeks ago, and we kind of wanted to cover everything within the power and energy space in Scotland. And Fraser has written some wonderful academic pieces, and his comments on Twitter and the work that he does with Regen is really thorough. It concentrates on its main area of fuel poverty, but also a much wider kind of brief around the just transition. So it was a fascinating conversation that I had with him. We have over an hour on our Patreon site, but it's cut down for our live broadcast about 40 minutes. But we still cover loads of stuff. Just Transition has thoughts on local councils, which I think you'll find really interesting, Karen, and how difficult it is for them to find money for things like Just Transition when there's buildings falling down and all these other issues. That's a really fascinating bit. We also cover GB Energy, and he's actually quite positive about GB Energy, so it's quite interesting. Loads in this episode. I think you'll really enjoy it. Please do comment, drop in any questions, and we'll see where we get to, and we'll see you back in about 40 minutes time. But please do say hello on the chat. It'd be nice to hear from you while we watch the video. Hope everyone enjoys this, and see you in a bit.
Bye.
Fraser Stewart, thanks so much for joining us in Dundee for this interview on SCOTONOMICS. Thanks so much for coming down. It's fairly local for you, isn't it?
It's very local for me, yeah. I'm just 10 minutes north on the way to Aberdeen there, on the way to Forfar. So yeah, it's ideal. Thanks for making the trip.
Well, we're happy to come up and see you. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your role at Regen and your interest in Just Transition?
Sure. So I work at an organisation called Regen. We do research, we do lobbying and advocacy to support a just transition to a clean energy system. Within Regen, I lead on all of our just transition work. And that's not unique to any one sector. That covers everything from down at household and community level, making sure that people will be able to afford their bills as we transition to clean technologies, gas boilers to heat pumps, right the way up through local authorities up to national government level Ofgem regulator, trying to make sure that all the market conditions, all the policies, all the strategic planning that you do, that big scale to build the clean energy system, making sure that that's got principles of fairness built into the heart of it, so that as we do this transition, it's not just about lining the pockets of developers or hoping for the best and that nobody's left behind. It's making sure that people, especially those already on the margins of the energy system and in society more generally, are front and centre.
Fantastic. So our viewers will be aware of this term, a just transition. What does that mean for you? Have you got a short definition that you use?
I do have a short definition, I do. So for me, a just transition is for the energy sector, is a transition to a clean energy system that avoids creating additional harm to people who are already harmed by the energy system, that recognises society as inherently unequal and works to bring people along that are excluded as it stands, that doesn't create any new burden on people. And I think the bit that I add in that isn't always included in that actively benefits people who are most at risk of being left behind as a priority. So people in fuel poverty, people in low-income situations, people from more disadvantaged socio-economic backgrounds, people in working class communities that have been left behind through deindustrialisation, putting them right at the front to make sure that they actively benefit as a priority from the energy transition. So it's not just about recognising existing injustices and trying not to make them worse, it's trying to redress them as we go about this massive socio-economic and technological transition.
Because what you're saying is like you've got to have a focus on the justice and the element that if we're changing our whole system, we've got to make sure that that's at least not detrimental to the people who are already struggling with the system as it is at the moment.
Absolutely. So the common strapline, if you will, for a just transition is making sure that nobody's left behind. And I think that's fine and I think that's appropriate. But for me, we're at this formative moment, right, where everything that we do in society, in the UK and around the world, is changing to tackle the climate crisis, right? Everything from energy, industry, housing, transport, land, economics, how you get about your towns and cities, where you go on holiday, the things that you eat.
Or it should be.
It should be.
It should be.
But everything is up for grabs, right? Everything is to change to tackle the climate crisis. We can absolutely change those things in a way that addresses these existing injustices. I don't think we've had as big a societal change globally, let alone just in the UK, in 100 years or more, since the first proper wave of industrialisation, probably. So I think at this moment we have a kind of, I'm going to say once in a, we can avoid the independence language, once in a lifetime, once in a generation opportunity to really make meaningful changes. And that's the attitude that I take into it. I think it's not just about not leaving people behind or let's try and make sure that nobody's energy bills goes up and everything else will be okay. It's like, no, this is a massive opportunity. Let's treat it like that and go into it with that verve.
How are we doing? Since you've been so enthusiastic about how everything can work.
We're not doing as good as we could be, and there's a few reasons for it. I think we're at a point now where actually, if we focus in on the UK, if we're looking at Scottish government, if we're looking even at the new Labour government at UK level, we're dealing with policymakers, politicians who are broadly sympathetic to the idea, who understand that the energy system as it stands isn't wholly fair or just, that the transition as you electrify things like your gas boiler for a heat pump or whatever it might be, that these things, there's a big risk of having some unintended consequences. They put bills out for people, causing disruption for people, etc. I think there's a recognition now that you can't have that happen and do all these things that you want to do. They need to go hand in hand if you want to deliver the action that we need to deliver to decarbonise energy, decarbonise society. It has to be done in a fair way, otherwise people are going to get very pissed off very quickly, and rightly so. You don't want to harm anyone in that process. So I think in terms of the narrative, certainly there's an understanding that needs to happen. In terms of progress, we're not really there yet. We've had the last 14 years, the last Conservative government weren't really interested. They weren't really interested in moving the dial on the whole sort of net zero project in a huge, meaningful way. Anyway, we see that evidenced in the de facto ban on offshore wind in England. They really slowed things down in a lot of ways.
And the new licences for oil and gas as well. Yeah,
exactly. The sentence. Progress was made in terms of decarbonisation, but not necessarily above and beyond other places. So I think the transition itself has always had a little bit of traction, but we've not made the progress we needed to. UK-wide, Scotland's made a lot of progress. But on the just transition side of it, we're now at a moment where we have a very narrow window to do this stuff, but a good understanding that it has to be done fairly or it's not going to fly. So we've not made the progress, but I think we're at a point where we can start to do it.
So picking up from what you've said there is, you see a difference between Westminster's approach, and let's say kind of up until now, with the new Labour administration and the Scottish Government's approach. When I'd done some research on just transition, I found the use of the term just transition once in papers released by the UK government, and that was about a just transition for the financial services sector. So I don't even think they understood the concept, whereas just transition has been a central plank of the Scottish government's policy for, I don't know, at least 5 years, longer than that.
Yeah.
But can you see that solid difference between Westminster and Holyrood?
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's one of the key differentiations, one of the key distinctions between Scottish government is that Scottish government are thinking much more holistically, thinking much more socially and economically about energy. UK government is thinking about the market, has thought about the market broadly defined. It's about how do you get private capital in, how do you get developers building. They've not even done that for a long stretch of this phase, but it's very much that the market will fix it, the market will sort itself out in one way or another. So I think that's been the fundamental distinction in ideology is along those lines.
So you think the Scottish Government doesn't focus on foreign direct investment?
Oh no,
No.
They absolutely do. But they're certainly more interested, and I would say more hands-on in thinking about the social and the economic impacts in the way that they talk about a just transition, with the just transition principles, which, fluffy as they are, they're there, and they exist. At UK level, we've seen a little bit more mention of just transition, I'm going to say over the last 2 years specifically, thinking about oil and gas, because it's been such a hot topic around the new licensing rounds that haven't gone ahead. Well, the early ones that did go ahead, but the ones that have since been quashed. So there's been a bit more talk about a just transition for workers, but it never bridged the full sort of spectrum of energy or climate in the way the Scottish Government has.
Yeah.
And I think now we're at a stage where Labour, in my view, or from their early messaging, seems to understand that better. And they could do well to take a steer from Scottish Government and Welsh Government as well, who have their own just transition principles and just transition framework. They could do well to take a steer from those devolved governments in terms of how you begin to implement that. That's not to say Scottish Government have done an amazing job of implementing it, but the principle, the bedrock of it exists.
But when I was looking at the just transition within the Scottish Government, you found slightly different ideas and definitions depending on the paper you were reading. And if you kind of threw it all together, it looked like this kind of silver bullet, right? It was this kind of like, hey, this is a great way to, the old favourite which we dislike on the show, it's a great way to grow the economy, right? But it was loads of new jobs, it was reducing inequality, eliminating poverty. It was just this, at the end of it, you're like, this is absolutely fantastic. And it was, one of the papers mentioned international climate justice as well. So it was this thing, and you were thinking, this is amazing. That's so much for one policy to do, isn't it? Do you think we should really kind of draw back from that and say, this is what the just transition is in Scotland, this is what it's going to focus on, and this is what it is in the UK, and this is what it's going to focus on?
I think it would, to an extent. I think there needs to be some kind of alignment, and the reason that there needs to be some kind of alignment between UK Government and Scottish Government, the definition and how they work towards it, and again, Welsh Government and Northern Ireland, the reason that there needs to be some consistency is because so much of the policy contained within necessary for a just transition is reserved. So when you think about the high-level energy sector, the market design, the regulation, how you operate the energy system is all big reserved stuff. So even in one sector, Scotland can't do that at all. It can do a lot towards it, but it can't do everything you would need to really secure.
But so is industrial policy.
Absolutely.
It's reserved. Transportation, workers' rights. So if you were wanting to bring loads of people in to help the energy transition, you can't do that in Scotland. The conditions for work have got a little bit more scope in Scotland. So we're really struggling to look at how the Scottish Government delivers a just transition within this devolved settlement if the UK Government isn't fully supportive. And that's certainly where I see it. If the UK Government says, we want a just transition and we're going to help you, then it can be achieved in Scotland. But if that doesn't come from Westminster, then we're unable to deliver it. And that was our kind of summary after our research. What's your thoughts on that?
I think it's correct. I think it's absolutely appropriate. It's that alignment, that sort of from the central UK government right across the system is ultimately essential to doing it. None of that is to top down the work that Scotland, Wales, others can do and have been doing themselves. And I think it's entirely appropriate that a just transition has a very strong local democratic element to it as well. And Scotland's not local, it's big and there's lots within that. But you can't have UK government, you can't have Westminster dictating all these different policies to everyone, but they have to be aligned in terms of an agreement. What are the principles of a just transition that we're all working towards in all these different sectors? You have to have consistency in that, otherwise you cannot deliver it. If you've got devolved policy around whatever it is, the development of new onshore wind that clashes with reserve policy or England and Wales policy or whatever it might be, you're never going to secure it in the same way when you're working across one energy system. It's not feasible to do that. But there's also then the question of resource. If you have a block grant which Scottish Government can, appropriate how it wants to an extent, with a lot of conditionality on it, but even that, the amount of money you would need to secure a truly just transition, that is fuel poor households being able to switch to heat pumps and not be penalised with high electricity costs, supporting extensive community ownership of onshore wind developments, which Scottish Government comparatively does quite well, but still doesn't do nearly the scale that we'd like to see it done. That all takes money. And if UK government aren't funding that themselves, and it's not coming sort of channeled through the block grant, that's going to be a challenge for Scottish Government to do it at the scale that they would ultimately, I think, like to.
Yeah, for me, that's a really important point. There's the word that you said was scale.
Yeah.
And I think the Scottish Government's approach to this has been kind of commensurate with the level of resources and authority they've got. So I think they've done a good job on just transition. But my feeling is that the Scottish Government should be saying, we do not have the economic powers available to do a proper just transition, but here's the things that we can do. But if you read the consultation papers and any of the strategy papers, they say we will achieve Scotland's just transition. And I think this is a huge issue because you've highlighted where the issues are with the level of resources that they have. When you speak to policymakers, are they really confident that they can deliver the types of things that they're saying in the strategy documents? And do you ever say to them, well, how are you going to do that?
That's a good question. We do ask. The main question that I ask, and I know people who I work with in this space in a similar role to me, who are sort of, let's say, critical friends at Holyrood and maybe just critical at Westminster, the question that we ask is always how. What is the detail? Where are the delivery plans that show how we're going to get from A to B on this, and how are you going to know once you've got there? A just transition, again, you highlighted at the start, is something that, depending on who you talk to, has slightly different definitions all over the shop. Scottish Government has principles, it has outcomes. The outcomes are very vague and very fluffy, and it's very, very difficult to pin those down. We still don't have within those principles a clear monitoring and evaluation framework, which lets you know, okay, we've hit this. If you think of it, let's take the example of fuel poverty. I sit on the Scottish Government's Fuel Poverty Advisory Panel again. Critical friends, are you doing enough to eradicate fuel poverty, which is the target by 2040 in Scotland? You have a very clear thing you can measure. Do you still have fuel poverty in Scotland by 2040? Yes, you do. You've missed your target. No, you don't. Well done.
These are unusual for governments to have these types of targets. The Scottish Government's often criticised for missing its targets.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the challenge I think that they've had when we're talking about a just transition. The idea of how do you monitor it, how do you know what success looks like, hasn't been easy to pin down. It's been a few years and more than a few dozen conversations back and forward about how you do that. It's a difficult thing, partly because the outcomes that Scottish Government define, they have 8 national outcomes for a just transition. The outcomes that they define, again, are quite high level. It's not a bad thing. It gives you a bigger target to aim at. But when it comes down to measuring that, what do we mean by justice? What do we mean by fair? Does it mean that an equal proportion of all income groups across society have a heat pump or an electric vehicle or high energy efficient houses? What does it actually mean in practice? So we've never really been able to pin it down. How many former oil and gas workers are now in the renewable sector, for instance? There are some things that you can do, but pinning it down across the board, I think, is quite a challenging thing, which means putting detailed plans in place has proven quite difficult. But I think from my perspective, and this is speaking very personally, I think at this point, just get on with it. Write the plan that you think will get you closest to the target that you're aiming for and get on with it. We saw with the 2030 target in Scottish Government, this was 80% of net zero by 2030, or whatever the exact target was, and they had to roll back on it because it had been, overestimated how much progress that they would make. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing to climb down from it. It gives you something to aim at. But again, the key thing, the reason that you haven't reached that target, it's not realistic, is there hasn't been the action and the detailed planning behind it to deliver it.
Yeah.
We're beyond consultation now.
You're right, but I think there is the reason it wasn't achieved is because you don't have the levers to do it. You can have all the will and attention, but if you've not got the power to do it.
Those detailed planning exercises, as much as they can seem like an arsehole and they can be a bit of a time drain sometimes, you do that once, you do that right, you can at the very least expose where the shortcomings are likely to be. If you're not doing those detailed plans, which, I don't know work all across Scottish Government, I'm sure there's lots of work that does go into these, but you don't have those detailed plans, public facing, that big vision that everyone can work towards, that industry, business, even households themselves, they know what we're all trying to do and we can all pull in that direction. Without that, it becomes very, very challenging. But completely agree as well, without that, and this speaks to our alignment point, without that alignment from UK government, where so much of this is still reserved, it becomes especially challenging. It means that you can say, okay, we've got a detailed plan for half our just transition stuff that we want to do, but actually half of it we're just going to have to ask Westminster really nicely.
And hope and pray. So one of the other challenges is I feel that the money that's been allocated by Scottish Government and maybe even local authority for a just transition is in the kind of nice to have fund. So if, for example, you have to find money to pay your backdated salaries for people in the council, that comes from a type of fund that might be put towards a just transition. If that happens, that's a huge challenge, isn't it? Not to have that guaranteed amount of money, as you said, when you're trying to manage a budget overall. Are these types of things common within the just transition process?
Very common, very common. We hear it from local authorities, particularly across the UK, not just in Scotland, but across the UK, who have various, statutory duties. There are things that they have to carry out as local authorities. So when it comes to doing your budget every year, or bigger budgets every few years, you have a look down the list, and at the top of the list you've got, these are all the things the government says, Scottish Government or UK Government, they say we have to do this, right? Tick, tick, tick. What money's left over? What can we feasibly do with it? So some local authorities, and again I include English local authorities within this as well, Bristol's a good example. Bristol are sort of fairly well to do as a local authority, but they have their own just transition plan as well. It's not just a Scotland thing, but very much in that vein. If something were to happen, bear in mind a lot of local authorities are on the verge of going bankrupt. It's not even just we don't have enough money to do the things that we want to do. It's we don't have enough money to make sure we're going to have the lights on in 6 months or a year's time. Birmingham had to declare bankruptcy just last year. So it's that kind of the house is on fire in a lot of ways for a lot of local authorities.
That's such a good analogy, because no one's tending the garden, which is how you could kind of view environmental policies when the house is on fire.
Yeah. Exactly. That's exactly
that was your analogy, no?
That was I appreciate you finishing the sentence. But that's exactly what it is. So when you have a local authority, so have you thought about your just transition plan? Have you developed a local decarbonisation plan that tackles fuel poverty and all that stuff? So we really, really like to, but actually we can't afford to fund the high school for the next 2 years. We're really struggling with that. Our baseline social care services are also, patchwork. They're through the floor. We can't get the staff. We can't get the regulators in to make sure everything's working, etc. So it's exactly that. A lot of it falls into nice to have just now, not because a just transition is nice to have. Most recognise it's essential.
But that must be really difficult for you. And this is the fundamental difference between a currency user and a currency issuer, is that when you're a currency user like the Scottish Government or local authority, you've only got a set budget. So you're saying to them, you need to do the just transition, and then someone could say to you, what, more than education?
Yeah.
And how do you kind of have that argument where you say it is important and we have to do it, but is it more important than this? Is it more important than that? And that's why I think it's so important that we focus this on how do we go to the currency issuer, which is the UK government, and say we need more money to do all of this. We can't be in a situation where we're fighting for fighting for money between these two resources when the currency issuer can just create this currency to bring in these resources.
Well, this is the thing with local authorities as well, is there is no route out of this to any of the myriad issues that local authorities face that doesn't involve giving local authorities more money to do stuff. They, according to the Climate Change Committee, they hold responsibility for around 80% of all net zero policy. They're not solely responsible, but they have local authorities have some remit over about 80% of net zero policy. you cannot deliver on that without more resources. Full stop. There are no two ways about it. In terms of, you mentioned there, William, the sort of how do you have that conversation, how do you have that debate with a local authority that says, yeah, no, it all sounds great, but actually the school's just burned down, so we're going to have to do something about that. There are two things, and it speaks to conversations like this across the spectrum. I do a lot of work in community centres, chatting in communities like my own working class communities where people maybe climate's not top of their agenda, right? Worried about their energy bills, worried about paying the rent at the end of the month, feeding the kids, etc. And the answer's the same. It's two things. The first thing is you're on listening mode. You're trying to understand the problem first and foremost, and try and make the case where you can that actually there's a lot to a just transition that solves a lot of these problems. But the second point is if you're someone who in an organisation like Regen, like I'm in, who has a little bit of access to government, to national government, to devolved government, it's making sure that you understand the issue so that you can then make the case, because it's not a local authority's fault if they don't have a just transition plan at this moment in time, in my opinion. It's systematic underfunding and manufactured austerity over the last 14 years that's sort of plunged us into this spot now.
Yeah. Okay, so let's look at some of the things that we're doing in Scotland and where you could suggest improvements, or maybe you think we're doing really well. There's community payments that happen in Scotland from offshore and onshore wind. So these bits of infrastructure, green infrastructure, go up, and as a kind of recompense to the local community, there's a payment made towards them. That's in principle. Could you just kind of break down some of maybe the good and the bad and the ugly within that overarching frame?
Absolutely. So the way that community benefit funds is what we talk about from particularly onshore wind developers, but increasingly offshore wind are stumping up cash for local communities as well. We're not supposed to call it compensation, because it's not meant to be compensation. It's meant to be funding for a project that a developer has worked meaningfully alongside a community to build. They've agreed how much money they should be getting. The standard across the UK is £5,000 per 1 megawatt of whatever the farm is, and that can be quite lucrative to some.
But that's a recommendation, isn't it?
It's a recommendation.
It's not you must do this. Yeah.
Absolutely. Most developers do build to that, although some of them can be a little bit in and out and non-committal with it. But once they've committed to it, they deliver it, and that's for a community organisation or a group of community organisations to decide how they then use that money. A good example of it, I'm going to get onto why I don't like it as the only thing that developers do. But a good example of that happening is the 9cc project in Cumnock in the Doon Valley. They've got a group of 9 different communities, and they all come together. So each community, each area of the community gets their own cut of a local, in fact it's 3 local wind farms. They negotiated their share with those developers collectively. Each community gets a cut, and then they have a regional, kind of more strategic, big project type pot that gets used democratically to decide how it's spent. That's it on a very, very good day. That's how that operates, and how it should operate. More often than not, it's the local development trust or a couple of community councillors meet up with the developer, they agree how much is going to get paid, and then they hold the purse strings. Community groups come and they apply and they say, we want to use new football kits for the kids' team. Will apply to the community benefit fund, etc. Sometimes in the early days of community benefit, these funds can be pretty hefty. You're talking tens of, sometimes up to the hundreds plus thousands of pounds per year to local communities. That's not to be sniffed at. The challenge with it is one of, as you've identified, it's not mandatory, so developers don't have to do that. 2, particularly in lower income communities, you don't necessarily have the capacity in communities already, or at least not the expertise to know how to negotiate with a developer a fair deal for your community. So developers hold all the cards. It's very much in their gift to give that money to those communities. This is my big bugbear with it. Once you get into community benefit funds and how they're spent, it then becomes a little bit challenging as well, because sometimes you might have gatekeepers in a community who they only like to fund certain things, might be very political. Often it's not very representative of the community, because the people who manage those funds, whether they're community councillors or whatever, do thankless work, often do very, very good work, but tend to be from very similar backgrounds. They may be retired, they have a bit more time on their hands. So it's not necessarily always getting into maybe tackling fuel poverty or whatever it might be locally, as can be the case. So
and I'll just make a point here that this is the case for all policymakers, that you've got this kind of Overton window where you see the concern and the priorities, isn't it? That where you're aware. The example I often use is if I was the cultural minister of Scotland, I would be putting a lot of money towards small music venues because that's my background. Someone else would be delivering it to opera, or so there's an inherent problem with that. It's just a structural bias that's really difficult to go over. So you're saying in this space the money's coming in, but the people who are deciding are thinking, we need more flower pots in the high street.
Yeah,
because that's what they're aware of, and that's where we are. So that was just a general.
No,
point,
but it's a fair point, and I think it's important to say that it's not the case for every community that happens. There are a lot of communities where lots of stuff happens, and they're more sort of let's say proactive about the democratic side of it, making sure that lots of different groups are represented, etc. And that tends to be the way that things are going from not necessarily from the developer side, but certainly from the government, the local authority side, is making sure that developers are meeting with the right people, they're convening the right sort of, a nice representative cross-section of a population to decide on these things. The challenge with that, though, as we mentioned, is that it's at the developer's behest. It's their gift. They hold all the legal expertise. It's nothing for them to come in and steamroll a community and say, you know what, actually, we're not going to pay you as much, or we're going to give you this deal, and then they step straight back out and treat it as compensation, which is quite dirty to me. Where we're moving to now, and I think from a just transition perspective, it's one thing to have kickbacks from a developer. It's never going to compare to the amount of money that they're making that's then going into the international shareholders' pockets. That's where the rubber meets the road on the just transition side of things. Who is actually benefiting from this, at what scale, and what is that money being used for? This is where we get into the conversation around ownership, which is, I think, again, we've been kind of banging our heads against the wall under the Tories for the last while. So this is where we get into the conversation around ownership. Who actually owns these assets? If you're driving to work, for instance, if I'm coming from Fordford to Dundee along the Joe Carriageway, I can see wind turbines up across the side. I know that I don't feel any benefit from that other than clean energy, which is great, which is an amazing thing. But I know that it's not me or my community that owns those assets. I know that the profits aren't predominantly coming back into our community. So when you look at the argument, part of the argument from ownership is not just that it can support things like community wealth building, which we will get into in a little bit, but it's also the scale of the revenue that comes into communities via that. The participation, the stake that communities then have in that project is so much higher than just the kickback in community benefit funding. I think Aquaterra did this research a couple of years back, and it showed that the amount of revenue that went back into communities when they owned the wind farm versus when they got community benefit was above 30 times the amount of benefit they were making. That is astronomical numbers, but it's not just the money that they get. They then have a democratic ownership stake in that project, in the future of that project. So when they're decommissioning, when they're selling it on to other developers to run it, when they're repowering it, if that's the case, that's all within the community's power, within their control. So there are so many more benefits around ownership that are so much more positive for a just transition rather than just the kickbacks. Appreciating that private developers will still be building for years to come, and we'll need them to build for years to come. We can't wait for communities to all sort of get together and club together and do this themselves. But if we're thinking about how do communities benefit from a local wind farm or whatever, it might be on bills, it might be in community benefit fund, but shared ownership of those assets or community ownership of those assets is always going to get us a far bigger slice of the pie.
Let's look at community wealth building then. How important is that principle? What does that mean to you when we're talking about the energy infrastructure and energy policy across the UK, but specifically in Scotland?
I think community wealth building, if done well, is probably the epitome of a just energy transition, where a community or a local area or whatever, it might be the council level, or it might be individual communities, own their own renewable generation, a wind farm, solar farm, whatever it is, generates revenue that goes back into that community and is spent on that community's needs to regenerate for whatever it might be. That circular nature of it, and that might be invested in decarbonisation or fuel poverty or whatever, as determined suitable by the community themselves. That circular sort of nature of it, capturing all those wider benefits, for me feels like exactly where a just transition sits. It's the just transition in a nutshell. And I think it's incredibly important, especially at a time as we keep coming back to, at a time where, on the back of over a decade of austerity, local authorities, public services, all hammered to bits, having more local control and more local economic opportunity that you have full sort of democratic mandate over. that for me is the sweet spot.
It's so powerful, isn't it? When you can make the decision what to do with an asset.
Yeah.
It is so. It's not just the revenue that comes from it. It's a sense of power that you have to be able to decide what you want to do with this. For me, community wealth building is always about focusing on the stock. And we focus in economics, we focus too much on the flow. GDP is a perfect example. We were focusing on this flow. What we have to getting foreign direct investment is another flow. We actually have to look at these things, see how are they affecting the stock of wealth, and we have to understand that better when we're moving forward. So could you talk to kind of like the role of the regulator and maybe what it could do if it took a slightly different approach? So let's imagine you were, influencing policymakers in Westminster or in an independent Scotland. You say, right, we've got a new regulator. This is what it could or should do. What are your thoughts on that?
So it's a good question. I've been asked it before. And I have lots of ideas, but as it stands, Ofgem, the current regulator, has two main duties as it pertains to consumers in the retail market, people who buy their electricity from suppliers or their energy from suppliers. The first is around the delivery of net zero. They're supposed to sort of aid and support the delivery of that towards the National Net Zero Mission. And the second is around delivering energy at the lowest viable cost for consumers. Anything beyond that, anything between that is largely for the market to sort itself out, and Ofgem tries to regulate to make sure that the market's doing what it's doing. The main way that Ofgem currently monitors, and the main way that we currently assess the health of the market is people switching tariffs. So we say we've got a healthy market if people are switching tariffs because that means it's competitive and they're fighting to keep their costs down. That is a very market mindset, but it also captures none of the things that actually matter to people in their homes, right? Most people just want to be able to switch the light on, pay the bill at the end of the month, and know that it's not going to cost them an arm and a leg to do so. That's not the case at this moment in time, even with this stipulation that they're trying to keep costs as low as possible. So I think what we need is a far more expansive set of principles that Ofgem are working to, including the eradication of fuel poverty, including just transition principles, including making sure that suppliers are fulfilling their duties of care, particularly to people in vulnerable situations, whether that's older people, people with medical dependencies, people on extremely low incomes, etc. There's a little bit of that goes on, a little bit of that regulation to make sure that the suppliers are playing nicely.
Yeah.
And if they're not playing nicely, they get fined, money goes into a pot, and that money then gets spent on fuel poverty support, which is, again, a nice cyclical thing that shouldn't have to happen because the suppliers
with a lot of administration eating up the funding within that.
Exactly. So my thing would be very much a more, I guess, a principles-based regime for regulating the supply market, in particular, supplier to consumer relationship, focused on fuel poverty, focused on the just transition, because they're two very interlinked things. The way that, if you think about fuel poverty just now, that is, for most people, it's the combined cost of their electricity and their gas. More people are going to be switching to electricity over the next 10, 15, 20 years. How do you make sure, given that electricity currently is about 3 times higher per unit than gas costs just now at the supply level? Not at generation. When you generate it, it's cheaper to generate electricity, but it's cheaper to supply gas into households at the scale that we do it just now. So how do you make sure that people are then not paying through the roof for electricity when they get a heat pump if they can't afford it already? How do you make sure people aren't plunged back into fuel poverty in the longer term? That has to be an Ofgem responsibility, but it also has to be a supplier responsibility, a devolved government responsibility, a UK government responsibility to make sure, again, as we said before, that everything pulls in that direction of a just transition so that all the fundamentals of the market, assuming that the market continues to look in some way as it does just now, maybe overhauled and reformed to suit net zero, but to make sure that all principles are embedded at the ground floor of the market, of policy making, of the infrastructure that we build, of the support we provide for people to install clean technologies, that this idea of eradicating fuel poverty is central and statutory. So it's legally binding in the same way that net zero by 2050 is. Because again, I don't believe you can do one without the other. And I don't believe you would want to.
That's such a jump from where we are. So if you use something like the Hayden's policy paradigm, which we've covered before on the show, you would kind of say, well, you have to set the target to be the market, but you have to measure it external to the market. So you have to say the market's a success if fuel poverty goes to zero. So you have to use a measurement outside of it. But it's a market measurement. measure the success of the market, which seems to be what we've got.
Homework, essentially. But this is the thing, and it boils down to this very, very fundamental, but I think very important question that we need to ask at this moment, like we said, when everything's up for grabs, is what do you want energy to do? Before you introduce the market, before you introduce developers, what do we want energy to do? Is a healthy market when people switch from one supplier to the other, or is it when they stick with one supplier for a long, long time because they're very, very good, their house is heated to a healthy, adequate standard, and they can afford to pay their bill every month, confident in the fact that it's not going to burst through the roof at any moment in time? That's the sign of a healthy market. So it's exactly this. It's what do you want energy to do? Is it about market competition? Should it be about market competition? We need to get this net zero thing done, and we need to get it done quickly. But we're at this moment now where actually the standards that we set, the foundations that we set in policy and regulation will determine what this transition looks like. If you're going to make a big change to the principles of the market and what it's supposed to operate
or the principles of supply.
Principles of energy overall. Is it about lining private developers, international shareholders' pockets, or is it about creating all these new opportunities in jobs for community wealth building, for local people and places? It can't really be both. Maybe it has to be both to some degree, because are the UK government suddenly going to change tack on the market? Probably not at this moment in time. But what do you want energy to do? Build that into your policy now. It has to be social focused. It has to be people, health, citizens, communities focused.
Yeah.
Or you're going to find a lot of backlash very, very quickly. And you're also going to miss this huge chance that you've got to do some genuine good and redress the wrongs of a market that kind of went to shit a long time ago.
Well, this is a wonderful segue into our final question then, which is GB Energy the solution to all of these things you'll be saying? I know there's a lot, you probably know a lot more than most people, but what can we expect from this idea of GB Energy?
So, depends who you ask. GB Energy means everything to everyone and nothing to no one at this moment in time. The way that we understand it, I actually do think it's a positive thing. I want to say with some apprehension. I think it's a good opportunity for UK government, not just of its own accord, but also to support local places, local communities, to take more ownership and more equity stake in energy projects. Through GB Energy, we've heard a lot about it's going to stump up cash to de-risk big, newer technologies like floating offshore wind, to make developers a bit less cagey about coming in with lots and lots of money and building themselves. In exchange, UK government will take an ownership stake and they'll take all the revenues back and they'll reinvest that. As far as the current sort of system of building stuff, which is all private developer led, it's a positive step because we don't take any stake in these projects as it stands just now. So it's a nice baby step towards some more public ownership. I think it needs to be more expansive. And I think, and they've made allusions to this within GB Energy with the local power plan, which they've outlined about $3 and a bit billion towards supporting local authorities and communities to take a shared ownership stake or to develop their own locally owned energy projects. That's a positive thing. That's money that hasn't been put into local and community energy before really at all, that scale of investment, which still pales in comparison to what they're putting up for de-risking bigger technologies. So I think for me, it can be a good thing. It certainly has some of the groundwork and language around, supporting more public and local ownership. It's good, but if it becomes a thing about let's make it easier for private capital to come in and build big stuff, I think that's a waste. It's a waste of taxpayer money. Yeah. It's a waste of the opportunity to really put power back into the hands of people, which is what any publicly owned company should be doing. It is your duty to build in sort of all these big technologies out, which needs to get done, but building it in such a way that it just gets done, and to hell with who makes the money out of it or who gets the value out of it. Or you, as UK government, should your responsibility be broader than that? And it absolutely needs to be. It needs to be about.
So wait and see what comes from the initial plans. Well, Fraser, thank you so much for joining us. A wonderful conversation. I hope you all enjoyed that so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you very much to Fraser for doing that interview for us. We covered a lot of ground in that 40 minutes. And I said we've got an hour, even longer interview on Patreon. Kieran, what did you pick up from that you want to highlight for the audience?
Yeah, I've got a number of highlights. So the first one I want to go into is with the wind farms. Fraser was talking about going past them in Forfar. Now, I've driven that road many times. so I know exactly where he's talking about as well. And also that that interesting aspect of now that we can see energy being made from the wind, I think we're having a different relationship and thinking about it, because I noticed that people are really thinking about the wind energy being transported away from Scotland and their bills, and and I think when energy was coming from the sea, you didn't see it. It literally went into pipes underneath the ground here in the northeast of Scotland, and people didn't see it.
It's
Whereas
much more
now
obvious, isn't it?
they see it being made, and they know it's being transported away, and they know that they're not benefiting from it. So I think to a certain extent, wind farms give us a sort of slightly colonial feeling about our energy now, especially now this big pipe is being built 500 kilometres between Peterhead and between Drax in Yorkshire. So I think people are really aware of that now. Another interesting thing he said was healthy market switching providers. Yeah, that's that he made a lot of good points around that. That's a really simplistic way of looking at energy and energy use and energy costs.
I said to him, but just to kind of re-emphasize, I said it's tautological. You measure the success of the energy market by how many people change suppliers in the energy market. So it's tautological. It just goes round and round and round. You have to take a measurement outside of the system. It can't be a market measurement to see how beneficial the market is. It's always going to be, effectively a positive result when you're using the market to gauge the market.
Yeah, and the other thing that you said as well, which I really agreed with, was community wealth building is the epitome of a just transition. And I think when we had our last conference in Dundee, that was really coming across more and more. I know that the British government have now taken over part of the grid. I don't think they've taken over the gas part of the grid. They've taken over the electric part of the grid. I need to check on this. I think there's also that feeling of we don't really control the grid. We don't feel like we've got any control over it. So yeah, that can be really unreliable as well.
I think that's a really good point, because I think it was maybe Hashbury in the comments there said that the politicians are speaking a lot about jobs being a just transition. And I would just like to highlight that, there's no real just transition if someone's working for an employer and they're just simply moved to work with another employer. The just transition has to be about so much more, and community wealth building is that kind of focus. Well, how do we ensure that asset is community owned and is returned for social benefit rather than private owned and return for profit? So that's a big part of the just transition. It can't just be about jobs, or basically we're making no progress towards a fair and equitable transition if that's not included.
And the other thing that you brought up right at the start as well, that a just transition should, encompass those that have been harmed by the energy industry.
Impact.
Yeah. And I mean, I feel that very acutely in Aberdeen, where we lost so many people through Piper Alpha, but lots of other people were lost in the early days of drilling for oil, because it was the Wild West out in the North Sea as far as safety was concerned. My dad worked out there. I heard some horrific stories of horrible accidents and stupid things going on there as well. So, a lot of people were harmed, especially in the early days, and they still are. People still die on oil rigs. They're still dying in helicopter accidents. There's still been a cost to human life even since Piper Alpha as well. So, that thing of people being harmed, and, that really struck me when he said that. Another thing that he brought up as well was Bristol. In Bristol, I am on the board of the Association for Public Service Excellence, and I met a councillor from Bristol a couple of years ago, and they were talking about an energy creation scheme that they had in Bristol, but he was very unhappy about the fact that he couldn't get money from the British government. They actually had to go to an American company. An American company helped Bristol to build that in Bristol. So, they're a city within England. Obviously, as far as we're concerned, England is the currency issuer, not Scotland isn't. But yet it won't help Bristol, something really smart and clever for its community. So Bristol, although he was saying it's really quite well off, Yeah, that wasn't the impression I got from that.
I think that's an important point that Fraser certainly spoke about. He was saying, we're willing to de-risk the investment from private sector, but there's no talk about de-risking the investment from councils.
Yeah.
Or what actually we're using public money for. Public money is not supporting a more devolved ownership of energy. It's being used to further promote the benefits to capital, and he highlighted that, and a just transition and community wealth building refocus that. Really a really central point, I think, of what Fraser was saying.
Yeah, and the last point I wanted to bring up was, he also points out that local authorities have 80% of the delivery of net zero policy. And I feel this very much because, we do deliver the things on the ground very much to people, rather than the government, which is the legislator. We're actually the delivery system to people on the ground. And we have impact assessments. With every report that we have has an impact assessment, and there is an environmental impact assessment with every report that I read from our officers before we take them to committees. And as he points out, for example, if a school burns down, that messes with your ability to maybe pursue your net zero ambitions, because suddenly you've had a big chunk of money taken out, you just can't do it anymore. And in Aberdeen, again, that's particularly acute for us, because we have discovered that 500 households have reinforced autoclaved aerated concrete, which is now unstable. So that again, that's affecting us very much as well in Aberdeen. I noticed as well that the Wellbeing Economic Alliance as well, who we've had one of their speakers in Dundee, and they were having a bit of a go at the Scottish Government about this. But actually the councils do a lot of impact assessment on this. I do wonder if the people from Wales are reading council papers as well as Scottish Government papers. I need to check with that guest that we've had on in Dundee and see if they are.
No, that's need to make sure they're on top of that. Well, thanks very much for those comments, Kieran. Anyone else who wants to drop anything into the chat, then please do before we disappear. We've got a comment here about GB Energy from Hashbury.
Oh, I didn't see that.
So I think, and then we've got another question here. It might be a pile of, I reckon that's slightly incorrectly. But I think, Fraser was, in a policy role and being front-facing with the UK government has to be positive on certain aspects. And I think he seemed to give GB Energy a fair crack of the whip at the moment. And I think it is, as he said, that we interviewed, I think it was about 3 weeks ago that interviewed him, but we're no clearer about GB Energy than we were 3 weeks ago. We still don't really know exactly what it's going to do. I think we do have to kind of give it the benefit of the doubt. One thing we do know is that it's going to be, the headquarters are going to be based in Aberdeen. We got that, whatever it's doing, it's going to be based in Aberdeen. And, I think you can take well, actually, Kieran, you're based in Aberdeen. How has that news gone down? What's your view on that?
Yes, one of the Labour councillors obviously had probably been lobbying for that as well. And he put a little film up of himself, sort of rejoicing when it was announced at the Labour conference. Of course, he's happy that it's coming to Aberdeen. We all are. But my understanding is actually they will be moving into the building across the road from me initially, which is the council offices at the moment, Marshall College. They might move into the buildings across the road. So I should have a good idea what's going on and how many employees they will be paying, and the regular civil servant wages that will be coming directly from the British government and that will be spent out into the Aberdeen economy. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so certainly I can see why everyone there would be positive, and it's certainly it's better than not being there. I think my point was that when someone is involved in colonial extraction, they're really smart if they put the headquarters near where the energy is being extracted. So this isn't any kind of, wow, thank you very much, that's amazing. It kind of makes sense if you look at it, if you take this kind of colonial extraction lens. I think I said on a comment or maybe on a thread on Twitter that we really need to celebrate when something comes to Aberdeen that's got nothing to do with the resources around Aberdeen. So, for example, if a new DVLA office was opened in Aberdeen, that's when you can say this is clearly nothing to do with any kind of colonial extraction, because it's based on a reason that's not about taking the resources from the area. So, is it fighting over scraps from the Lord's table? Possibly, but I can see why everyone in Aberdeen would be celebrating a win. It's a city that definitely needs it. Well, thanks very much, everyone, for your comments and questions. We've covered energy a few times. It's kind of one thing that seems to really get people involved, and I think it's down to that point that you said earlier, Kieran. I think people can see now, in a way that was hidden when we were talking about oil and gas, that there's so much power being generated in Scotland, and we don't have the industry here to make use of that power. We don't have the population here to make use of that power. And these decisions are all historical, and they're institutional, and they'll stretch back over a century. But we should be able to use all of the power that's generated in Scotland for manufacturing, for provision of services, for regenerating an industry, for powering our homes and everything that we need in Scotland. But we're not, for some particular reason, we're not the size to be able to use all the power that we're generating. So a lot of it is heading to other parts of the UK. And that's a huge issue. And I would like our audience not to lose sight to those kind of bigger issues, that we have all this power and it's going because no one has thought about our development, and they're just looking at Scotland as a way for us to take our power. And that's hard to argue, I would suggest. Well, thank you very much for watching. I haven't decided what we're going to do next week. We've got a couple of interviews on ice, and we've also got we're going to have the panel session from the Finding the Money film discussion, which I'm chairing in London tomorrow. That includes Zach Polanski, the deputy leader of the Green Party. So we're going to have access to that as well. So maybe tomorrow you and I can have a chat, Kieran, and we'll decide what to do next week. But one thing we know for sure, it'll be Wednesday. We'll start at 8:05. This is a regular time. Thanks, everyone, for joining us tonight. We'll see you next week. Bye from me.
Bye-bye.